The Valkyrie Dominion had spent 6 standard cycles studying the small blue planet called Earth before they made their decision to invade Admiral. Threxon stood on the bridge of his flagship and watched the data scroll across the holographic displays in front of him. He had conquered 17 species across 3 galactic arms, and not one of them had offered any real resistance. His analysts had studied everything about the humans below. They counted population centers and military bases, and weapon systems and economic output. They measured the primitive nuclear arsenals and the chemical burning vehicles and the laughably slow communication networks. The conclusion was always the same when it came to species like this: another world, ripe for conquest, another civilization that would kneel within days begin the invasion. Admiral Threxon commanded with absolute confidence in his voice. 12 carrier groups descended through Earth's atmosphere that morning. 2 million Valkyrie soldiers in gleaming armor with weapons that could vaporize steel dropped onto the major cities of the world. They landed in Moscow and Beijing and Washington and Delhi and Lagos and Sao Paulo and a dozen other population centers. The Valkyrie expected what they always found when they invaded primitive worlds. They expected screaming and panic and civilians running through the streets. They expected governments to broadcast surrender within hours. They expected the easy victory that had defined their empire for 1,000 years. What they found instead would haunt their species. For generations, Staff Sergeant Maria Santos was feeding her daughter breakfast in her small apartment in Sao Paulo when the sky turned dark with alien ships. She was 41 years old, with gray streaking through her black hair and old scars on her hands from 12 years of combat operations. She had served 3 tours in some of the most dangerous places on Earth, and she had killed more times than she cared to remember when the first explosions shook the city and her daughter screamed. In terror, Maria felt something shift inside her chest. It was not fear, it was recognition. She had been waiting for this moment her entire life without knowing it. Every soldier knows deep in their bones that peace is temporary. Every veteran keeps their skills sharp because they understand that violence always returns. Maria kissed her daughter on the forehead and told her to hide in the basement with the neighbors. Then she walked to her bedroom closet and pushed aside the hanging clothes to reveal the metal case she had kept hidden there for 15 years. Inside was her old service rifle and 300 rounds of ammunition and a tactical vest and a combat knife. She had cleaned and oiled every piece once a month for all those years. Her husband had asked her why she kept it all, and she had never been able to explain. Now she understood. She dressed quickly and efficiently with the muscle memory of 1,000 training exercises. Guiding her hands, she loaded the rifle and checked the sights and filled her vest with magazines. Then Maria Santos walked out into the burning streets of Sao Paulo to find her war cross. The world, that same scene repeated itself millions of times. In Moscow, a 73-year-old man named Viktor Kozlov heard the alien ships descending and felt his heart begin to race for the first time in decades. He had been a young conscript in brutal urban warfare 50 years ago, and he had never forgotten what he learned in those bloody streets. Viktor gathered his neighbors in the apartment building and began giving orders. He showed them how to barricade doorways and create firing positions and set up crossfire zones in the hallways. He taught them in 10 minutes what it had taken him years to master. They will come through the doors expecting frightened civilians. Viktor told them with cold certainty in his voice. They will find soldiers instead. In the mountains of Afghanistan, men who had been fighting invaders since before their grandfathers were born simply added one more enemy to their long list. They did not need to learn guerrilla warfare. They had been born into it. Their fathers had fought the Soviets, and their older brothers had fought the Americans, and now they would fight the Velkarith. Mountains had never been conquered, and they would not be conquered. Now in Grozny, veterans of wars that had reduced their city to rubble twice in living memory emerged from their homes with weapons they had hidden for exactly this kind of day. They knew every destroyed building and collapsed tunnel and hidden basement in the city. They had rebuilt their homes on top of ammunition caches and weapon stores that they had never declared to any government. Within hours, they transformed their ruined city into a maze of death for any invader foolish enough to enter. The Valkyrie ground commanders began sending confused reports back to Admiral Threxon within the first day. The civilians are not behaving as expected. One commander reported from Beijing. They are organized, and they are fighting back with unexpected coordination. We are taking fire from buildings we cleared an hour ago. Another reported from Lagos. The humans seem to appear from nowhere and disappeared just as quickly. Our supply convoy was destroyed by explosive devices planted in the road. A third reported from the outskirts of Delhi. We have not yet identified how the humans knew our route. Admiral Threxon dismissed these reports as the complaints of incompetent officers. No primitive species could organize effective resistance so quickly. Surely these were isolated incidents from a few unusually violent individuals. He was wrong. General Yuki Tanaka had retired from military service 5 years ago, but she had never stopped thinking like a soldier. When the invasion began, she made her way to an emergency bunker beneath Tokyo, where surviving military officers were gathering. She watched the tactical feeds coming in from around the world, and she saw something that made her smile despite the horror unfolding above them. They landed in our cities, she said to the officers around her. They thought that would terrify us into submission. She pointed to the screens showing urban combat across a dozen nations. They do not understand what they have done. She continued. Humanity has been destroying its own cities in warfare for thousands of years. We know urban combat better than any species in this galaxy. Every block and every building and every sewer tunnel is a weapon in our hands. They have not invaded our weakness. They have walked directly into our greatest strength. The first week of the invasion cost Valkyrie 30% casualties more soldiers than they had lost in their last 3 conquests combined. Admiral Threxon stared at the reports in disbelief. For the first time in his long career, he felt something cold and unfamiliar growing in his chest. It took him several moments to recognize the sensation. It was fear. The formal armies of Earth were still trying to organize when the real resistance began. Governments had fallen silent as their communication networks collapsed under Valkyrie jamming. Military command structures struggled to coordinate across continents that had suddenly become isolated islands. But the humans did not wait for orders. They never had. Across the world, veterans and fighters and survivors looked at the chaos around them and made the same decision without any coordination at all. They decided to fight. Colonel James Okonkwo had served in conflicts across 3 continents during his 30-year military career. He had studied asymmetric warfare and counterinsurgency and guerrilla tactics in every form they had taken throughout human history. When the invasion began, he was teaching at a military academy in Kenya, and he immediately understood what he was seeing. They fight like we did in the First World War, he told his students as they gathered in the basement of the academy building. Massed formations and rigid hierarchies and predictable logistics. They've never faced an enemy that refuses to stand still and die. Okonkwo began organizing resistance cells across the African continent using runners and hidden radio frequencies and methods that humans had perfected over centuries of fighting each other. He connected isolated groups of fighters and shared tactics and coordinated attacks across thousands of miles within weeks. He had built a network that the Valkyrie could not detect because it used no technology they knew how to find in the ruins of Snowpall. Maria Santos had gathered a force of 200 fighters. Most of them were veterans like her with decades of combat experience between them. The youngest was a 19-year-old girl whose grandfather had taught her to shoot before she could read. They moved through the destroyed streets like ghosts and struck the Valkyrie Wherever they found them, Maria had learned long ago that the key to guerrilla warfare was patience. You did not attack the enemy head-on where they were strong. You watched and waited and found the moments when they were weak. Then you struck fast and hard and disappeared before they could respond. The Valkyrie had never encountered this kind of warfare. Every species they had conquered before had tried to meet them in open battle where superior technology guaranteed victory. Humans refused to play that game. A Valkyrie patrol would march through a seemingly empty neighborhood. Then shots would ring out from a dozen hidden position. Soldiers would fall with holes in their armor where human marksmen had found the gaps. By the time reinforcements arrived, the humans would be gone, vanished into buildings and tunnels and sewers that they knew better than any map could show. Lieutenant Chen Wei was 53 years old when the invasion began. She had served in the military for 25 years before retiring to help raise her grandchildren when alien soldiers killed her son and his wife in the first wave of attacks. She felt something ancient and terrible awaken inside her. Her grandchildren were safe in a hidden bunker outside the city. Chen Wei gathered every veteran she could find and began hunting the Valkyrie through the streets of her hometown. She was not interested in strategic objectives or military targets. She wanted the aliens to understand fear. Her unit specialized in night attacks on isolated Valkyrie positions. They would creep through the darkness with knives and garrotes in silence. By morning, the Valkyrie would find their sentries dead. Without a single shot fired, Chen Wei left messages written in alien blood on the walls where the bodies were found. "We do not sleep." The messages said, "We do not forget. We do not forgive." The psychological effect on Valkyrie morale was devastating. Soldiers began refusing night watch duty. Officers reported that their troops were seeing human attackers in every shadow. Fear spread through the occupation forces like a disease. Admiral Threxan demanded explanations from his commanders, but none of them could provide answers that made sense. "They are farmers and teachers and factory workers," one general reported with confusion in his voice. "Our intelligence said they had no military training. How are they fighting like elite soldiers?" The Valkyrie did not understand what they were seeing. They could not comprehend a species where ordinary civilians had combat experience in their empire. Only professional soldiers trained for war. Concept of a veteran population was alien to them in the most literal sense, but humanity had spent 10,000 years teaching its children how to kill. Every generation had faced its own wars and conflicts and struggles. Grandfathers taught grandsons how to shoot and how to hide and how to survive. Grandmothers taught granddaughters how to tend wounds and make explosives from household chemicals and keep fighting when everything seemed lost. This knowledge passed down through families like precious heirlooms. The Valkyrie had calculated human military strength by counting soldiers in uniform. They had missed the millions of veterans who had returned to civilian life. They had missed the billions of humans who had grown up in regions scarred by war. They had missed the fundamental truth about humanity that their intelligence could not measure. Every human was a potential soldier, and now every human had a reason to fight. Viktor Kozlov in Moscow had held his apartment building against 3 Valkyrie assault attempts. His neighbors had become a disciplined fighting force under his training. Old men and women who had never fired a weapon before were now covering firing lanes and reloading magazines with practiced efficiency. People who had grown up in peace were learning the brutal calculus of urban warfare. One evening, after driving back another attack, Victor gathered his fighters on the roof of the building to watch the sun set over the burning city. "They think they are fighting a war," Victor said quietly. "They do not understand. For them this is conquest. For us this is survival. That is why we will win. There is nothing more dangerous in this universe than a human being with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for." Across the world, humans were discovering the same truth. They were not fighting for territory or resources or political power. They were fighting for their families and their homes and their right to exist. That made them more dangerous than any enemy the Valkyrie had ever faced. 3 months into the invasion, Admiral Thraxon received a report that made his blood run cold. Human engineers had captured a damaged Valkyrie vehicle and figured out how its weapon systems worked. Within weeks they had begun manufacturing copies using primitive Earth manufacturing techniques. The weapons were crude and unreliable and often exploded in the hands of their users, but they worked. Humanity was learning. They were learning fast. Admiral Thraxon looked out at the planet below his flagship and finally admitted the truth he had been denying since the invasion began. This was not going to be another easy conquest. This was going to be a war, a real war against an enemy that refused to surrender or die, or simply accept their fate. For the first time in the history of the Valkyrie Dominion, they had found a species that fought back, and they had no idea how to make them stop. The second wave arrived 6 months into the invasion. Admiral Thraxon had requested reinforcements from the Dominion High Council, and they had granted his request with surprise and disappointment in equal measure. No conquest had ever required reinforcements before heavy armor rolled down from orbit in massive landing ships. Atmospheric fighters screamed through the skies to establish air superiority. Orbital bombardment platforms took position above the major resistance centers, ready to burn entire cities if necessary. The Valkyrie were done playing games with these stubborn primitives. They would crush the resistance with overwhelming force and finish the conquest that should have been complete in the first week. But humanity had not been idle during those 6 months. Colonel Okonkwo now commanded a network that spanned the entire globe. Hidden manufacturing facilities produced weapons and ammunition around the clock. Engineers who'd spent their careers building cars and appliances had turned their skills to creating instruments of war. Scientists who had studied physics and chemistry in peaceful laboratories now designed explosives and guidance systems. The humans had captured enough Valkyrie technology to begin understanding it. They could not match alien manufacturing precision, but they could adapt and improvise and create functional copies. Tanks that had once seemed invincible began falling to human-made weapons that punched through their armor. The underground bunker beneath what had once been Nairobi served as the central command for the global resistance. Okonkwo stood before holographic displays that showed the positions of both human and Valkyrie forces across the planet. Representatives from every continent appeared on screens around him. They had built a communication network using captured alien technology mixed with ancient human techniques. Runners and coded radio bursts and even carrier birds in some regions where nothing electronic could survive. They are bringing heavy weapons this time, Okonkwo told the assembled commanders. Orbital platforms that can level cities. They expect us to concentrate our forces so they can destroy us from above. He smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. We will not give them that satisfaction. Disperse your forces immediately. No group larger than 50 fighters in any location. We become ghosts. We become shadows. We become the nightmare they cannot wake from. The resistance adapted within days. Large fighting forces dissolved into thousands of small cells that operated independently. They attacked supply lines and ambushed patrols and sabotaged equipment. They never gathered in numbers large enough to make orbital bombardment worthwhile. The Valkyrie orbital platforms sat in the sky with their devastating weapons ready, but no targets worth destroying. Maria Santos led her cell through the jungles outside Snow Paulo, hunting Valkyrie supply convoys. They had learned the routes and schedules through patient observation and captured intelligence. Every convoy that failed to reach its destination meant Valkyrie soldiers went without food and ammunition and medical supplies. Make them bleed slowly, Maria told her fighters. Every bullet they waste searching for us is a bullet they cannot use against someone else. Every vehicle we destroy is resources they cannot replace. We do not need to defeat them in battle. We need to make this war cost more than they are willing to pay. Chun Wei had earned a new title among the resistance. They called her the Ghost of Shanghai. Her unit had killed more Valkyrie officers than any other cell in the Eastern Hemisphere. She specialized in assassination and terror and making the aliens afraid to sleep. Her methods were brutal, and she made no apology for them. They came to our world and killed our children, she told a young fighter who questioned her tactics. I will give them nightmares that last for generations. When Valkyrie mothers tell their children scary stories, I want those stories to be about us. The young fighter had no response to that. In the skies above Earth, human pilots were learning to fly captured Valkyrie fighters. The learning curve was steep, and many died in the attempt. The alien controls responded to thoughts and reflexes that humans had to train themselves to produce. But humans had always been quick learners, especially when their lives depended on it. The first successful human flight in an alien fighter lasted only 12 minutes. The pilot, a former Air Force captain named Yusuf Patel, crashed during landing and broke both his legs, but he had proven it could be done. Within weeks, dozens of humans were training on captured craft. Within months, they were engaging Valkyrie fighters in aerial combat. They lost more than they won in those early days. Human reflexes were slower than Valkyrie pilots, and human training was inadequate for the advanced machines. But they learned from every engagement. They studied the wreckage of enemy fighters they managed to shoot down. They developed tactics that exploited weaknesses in Valkyrie formations, and slowly the gap began to close. 1 year into the invasion, General Yuki Tanaka addressed the first meeting of what they called the Earth Defense Council. Representatives from every major resistance network attended through secure holographic links. We have achieved something unprecedented, Tanaka said. We have fought a technologically superior enemy to a standstill. They control the skies and the orbits, but they do not control the ground. Every city they occupy becomes a drain on their resources. Every day this war continues is a day closer to their defeat. She paused to let her words sink in. But surviving is not enough. We cannot wait for them to give up and go home. We must take the fight to them. We must make them fear us. We must become the hunters instead of the hunted. The Council approved the first major offensive operation of the war. Human forces would attack and capture a Valkyrie forward operating base in what had once been Poland. It would be the first time humans attempted to take and hold alien territory. Instead of simply raiding and retreating, Chun Wei volunteered her unit for the assault. I am 54 years old, she told the planning committee. I have titanium in my hip and plasma burns across my shoulders. I have killed more aliens than I can count. I am not done yet. The attack came at dawn. After 3 days of careful preparation, human fighters struck from 12 different directions simultaneously. They had learned that Valkyrie commanders became confused when they could not identify a main assault force to respond to. The base fell in 6 hours of brutal close-quarters combat. 200 human fighters died taking it, but they held the position against 3 counterattacks. And when the sun rose the next morning, the flag flying over the base was blue and green, the colors that humanity had chosen to represent their united resistance. Earth, not any single nation, but all of humanity together. Admiral Frex An received the news on his flagship and felt something he had never experienced in his long military career. He felt the first stirring of doubt. These humans were supposed to be primitives. They were supposed to break under pressure. They were supposed to surrender when faced with overwhelming force. Instead, they were getting stronger. Instead, they were learning. Instead, they were winning for the first time. Admiral Threxheim began to wonder if this war could actually be lost. 18 months into the invasion, Admiral Threxheim faced a reality that no Valkyrie commander had ever confronted in the 1,000-year history of their empire's strategic failure. He stood before the holographic map of Earth and watched the red markers that represented Valkyrie-controlled territory shrink day by day. The Humans were not just resisting anymore. They were counterattacking. General Maria Santos now commanded the liberation forces of South America. She had risen through the ranks of the resistance through competence and survival. The soldiers who followed her and watched her fight beside them in the streets and tunnels and jungles, they trusted her because she had earned that trust with blood and sacrifice. Her forces had pushed the Valkyrie out of Brazil and Argentina and Chile now. They were advancing into the occupied zones of Central America. The weapons her troops carried were a mixture of captured alien technology and human-made copies. The uniforms they wore were patched together from whatever materials they could find, but they fought with a ferocity that made the Valkyrie professional soldiers look like children playing at war. "We are not fighting for territory," Santos broadcast to her troops as they prepared for another assault. "We are fighting to remind the galaxy that some species do not break. We are fighting to show the universe what humanity can do when we are pushed to the edge. Today, we push back." The assault on Mexico City was the largest human offensive of the war. 12,000 fighters converged from 3 directions, supported by captured armor and air cover from pilots who had learned their craft in desperate combat. The Valkyrie garrison numbered 5,000 soldiers with superior weapons and fortified positions. It should have been enough to hold against any attack. It was not. Santos had studied every battle the Valkyrie had fought since they invaded Earth. She had identified patterns in their tactics and weaknesses in their command structure. The aliens relied on orders from above. When their commanders fell, their units became confused and uncoordinated, so she sent her best infiltrators into the city 3 days before the main assault. They found the Valkyrie command post and mapped its defenses and identified the officers inside. When the attack began, human snipers took out the senior commanders in the first 30 seconds. The garrison fell into chaos without leadership. Human forces exploited the confusion with ruthless efficiency. They pushed through defensive lines that should have held for days. They captured weapon emplacements and turned them against their former owners. They showed no mercy because they had learned that mercy was a luxury they could not afford. By sunset, the flag of Earth flew over Mexico City. Admiral Threxan received the report on his flagship and said nothing for a long time. His staff waited in uncomfortable silence. "Recall all ground forces to defensive positions around the primary landing zones," he finally ordered. "We will not attempt to hold territory we cannot defend." It was an admission of defeat, even if he did not say the words. The invasion that should have conquered Earth in days was collapsing. After 18 months, Colonel Okonkwo watched the Valkyrie retreat from his command center with satisfaction that he did not allow to show on his face. "They are pulling back," one of his officers reported. "Should we pursue?" "Not yet," Okonkwo replied. "Let them concentrate their forces. Let them believe they can hold their remaining positions. We are not finished with them." He turned to another display that showed something the Valkyrie did not yet know about. Human engineers had been working in secret facilities beneath mountains and deserts for over a year. They had studied every piece of Valkyrie technology they could capture. They had reverse-engineered propulsion systems and weapons and shield generators. Now, they were ready to show the results of their work. Launch the first wave, Okonkwo ordered. Deep beneath the Sahara Desert, massive doors opened in the sand ships rose into the sky on columns of fire that mixed human rocket technology with alien propulsion systems. They were ugly and ungainly and built from whatever materials human engineers could find. They looked nothing like the sleek Valkyrie vessels, but they flew, and they fought. Admiral Threxan watched his tactical displays with disbelief as human ships engaged his orbital defense platforms. The alien vessels should have swatted these crude machines from the sky like insects. Instead, they found themselves in a fight. Human pilots flew with a recklessness that Valkyrie commanders could not comprehend. They dove into formations that guaranteed losses because they knew those losses would be worth it. They sacrificed themselves to create openings for their wingmates. They fought like beings who had already accepted death, and therefore had nothing to fear. One by one, the orbital platforms fell first, the weapons. Satellites that had threatened to burn cities. Then the communication relays that coordinated Valkyrie forces across the planet. Then the carrier ships that had served as Admiral Thraxan's eyes and ear. Shenwei led a squadron of captured fighters. In an attack on the Admiral's flagship itself, her ship was damaged in the approach, and she knew she would not survive the mission. She did not care. "This is for my son," she broadcast on open frequencies as she dove toward the massive vessel. "This is for my grandchildren who will never know their parents. This is for every human being you murdered when you came to our world. Remember us." Her fighter struck the flagship's main sensor array and exploded in a ball of fire. She died instantly, but the flagship was blind. Admiral Thraxan gave the order to retreat. His surviving ships turned and fled toward the edge of the solar system. They had come to Earth expecting easy conquest. They left having lost 4 million soldiers and 8 carrier groups, and their reputation of invincibility. The humans did not celebrate their departure. They knew this was not over. Santa stood on the steps of a ruined building in what had once been Snow Paulo and watched the last Valkyrie ships burn across the sky. "They will tell their empire what happened here," she said to the officers gathered around her. "They will tell them that humanity cannot be conquered. But that is not enough. Somewhere out there, 17 species live under Valkyrie rule. Species who never had a chance to fight back. Species who have spent generations believing resistance was impossible." She turned to face her commanders with steel in her eyes. "We are going to show them that it is not. The war for Earth was over, but humanity's war was just beginning." The Valkyrie Dominion had ruled their corner of the galaxy for 1,000 years. They had conquered 17 species and absorbed hundreds of worlds into their empire. No one had ever challenged their supremacy. One had ever fought back and won until now. News of what happened at Earth spread through the galaxy like wildfire. Valkyrie tried to suppress the information, but they could not silence every voice. Traders and travelers and escaped slaves carried the story to every corner of known space. A primitive species on a single world had defeated the invincible Dominion. They had fought with weapons they built themselves and tactics they invented and courage that defied all reason, and now they were building a fleet. General Okonkwo stood before the first session of the United Earth Defense Council in a chamber that had been carved from the bedrock beneath the Swiss Alps. Behind him, a holographic display showed the positions of the retreating Valkyrie fleet and something else human. "Ships in pursuit? We did not ask for this war." Okonkwo addressed the gathered representatives of every nation that had survived the invasion. "They came to our world and burned our cities and killed our families. They thought we would submit because every species before us had submitted." He paused and looked at the faces around him, old men and women who had fought in the streets, young soldiers who had grown up knowing nothing but war leaders, who had emerged from the chaos to guide their people through the darkest time in human history. "We showed them they were wrong," he continued, "but that is not why we are here today. We are here because out there in the galaxy, millions of beings live under Valkyrie oppression. They have never known freedom. They have never known hope. They are waiting for someone to show them that resistance is possible. We are going to be that someone." The council voted unanimously to authorize the first expeditionary fleet ships that had been built for defense would now carry war to the enemy soldiers who had fought to protect their homes, would now fight to liberate others. Maria Santos commanded the fleet. She was 60 years old now, with white hair and a body marked by decades of combat. She had lost her daughter in the final year of the invasion, and the grief had never left her, but she had gained something else, a purpose that went beyond survival. "We are not doing this for revenge," she told her crews as the fleet prepared to leave Earth orbit. "Revenge is empty, and it solves nothing. We are doing this because we understand what it means to be conquered. We know the fear and the despair and the feeling that no one will ever come to help. We are going to be the help that we wished for when we were alone." The fleet jumped to faster than light speed and vanished from human space. Their destination was a Valkyrie slave world called Kethrol's species that had been conquered 300 years ago. They had never known anything but servitude. Kethrol, a young female named Sira, worked in the mineral processing facility that had been her entire world since birth. She had never seen the sky without the shadow of Valkyrie warships. She had never known a day without fear. When the alarms began screaming, she assumed it was another punishment drilled. Valkyrie liked to remind their slaves who held the power. Then she saw the ships descending through the atmosphere. They were unlike anything she had ever seen, crude and angular and covered in symbols. She did not recognize the Valkyrie garrison, scrambled to respond, but they were too slow. Human soldiers poured from the landing ships with weapons blazing. They moved with coordination and ferocity that Sira had never witnessed. The Valkyrie fell before them like grain before a scythe. One of the human soldiers found Sira hiding in the processing facility. He was tall and dark-skinned with gray in his hair and scars on his face. He looked at her with eyes that held both kindness and terrible experience. "You are free," he said in the Valkyrie trade language that all slaves were forced to learn. "We have come to break your chains." Sira did not understand. Freedom was not a concept that existed in her world, but she saw the Valkyrie overseers being led away in restraints. She saw the guard towers burning. She saw the walls of the facility being torn down by human machines, and she began to understand that something impossible was happening. The liberation of Kethrol took 3 days. When it was over, General Santos addressed the freed slaves in the central square of the largest settlement. "We are humans," she told them through translation devices. 20 years ago, the Valkyrie came to our world and tried to conquer us. We fought back and we won. Now we have come to do for you what we wished someone had done for us. You are free. What you do with that freedom is your choice. But if you want to fight, if you want to liberate others as we have liberated you, we will teach you everything we know." Word spread from Kethrol to other slave worlds, stories of the strange beings who had defeated the Valkyrie and come to break chains. Some said they were demons, some said they were gods. The truth was simpler and more terrifying to the Dominion. They were humans, and they were not going to stop. 50 years later, the Galactic Free Council held its founding ceremony on a space station, orbiting a world that had once been the heart of Valkyrie power. 47 species sent representatives. Most of them had been liberated by human-led coalitions over decades of war. The first council speaker was a human woman named Elena Santos. She was the granddaughter of the legendary general who had led the first expeditionary fleet. She had grown up on stories of Earth's resistance and humanity's long crusade across the stars. When she stepped to the podium to address the gathered representatives, she carried the weight of all that history on her shoulders. "We are here today because beings across this galaxy refuse to accept tyranny as their fate," she began. "We are here because soldiers and fighters and ordinary people chose to stand against impossible odds. Many of them did not live to see this day. They fought knowing they might never see victory. They fought anyway." She paused and looked at the faces around her, beings of dozens of species, united by shared sacrifice and common cause. The Valkyrie called humanity primitive. She continued, "They called us weak. They called us prey. Now they call us allies and liberators and friends. But we remember what we were first, what we will always be when the galaxy tries to tell us our place." Elena Santos raised her voice so that it carried to every corner of the chamber and every world watching through the broadcast. "We are humanity. We survived. We fought. We won. And we do not kneel." The chamber erupted in applause that seemed to shake the station itself. Representatives from 47 species stood and cheered for the beings who had changed everything. Somewhere in the crowd, an old Kethral female named Syrah wiped tears from her eyes. She had lived long enough to see the impossible become reality. She had lived long enough to see freedom spread across the galaxy, and she had lived long enough to understand why the humans had done it. Not for power, not for glory, not for revenge. They had done it because they remembered what it felt like to be alone and afraid, and conquered. They had done it because they refused to let anyone else feel that way if they had the power to prevent it. They had done it because that was who they were, humanity. The species that would not break. The species that fought back. The species that taught the galaxy a lesson it would never forget. Some beings are not meant to be conquered. Those beings will find each other across the stars and stand together against any force that tries to chain them. That was the gift humanity gave to the galaxy: hope and the will to fight for it.